Growing up in a small town with no name on most maps had its quirks. It was the kind of place where the morning sun fought through thick mist to touch the ground, and the evenings were swallowed by shadows earlier than anywhere else I'd been. Despite its charm, there was an unshakable eeriness that surrounded the village, and that unease centered around a place called Ravenwood. Ravenwood was the remains of an old village that had been abandoned decades ago. It lay about 5 miles west of our town, shrouded by a dense forest and whispers of its cursed past. Some said the people of Ravenwood had angered something, an ancient spirit, a forgotten deity, or perhaps the village itself. Whatever the truth, the stories all ended the same. No one left Ravenwood alive. Growing up in a small town with no name on most maps had its quirks. It was the kind of place where the morning sun fought through thick mist to touch the ground, and the evenings were swallowed by shadows earlier than anywhere else I'd been. Despite its charm, there was an unshakable eeriness that surrounded the village, and that unease centered around a place called Ravenwood. Ravenwood was the remains of an old village that had been abandoned decades ago. It lay about 5 miles west of our town, shrouded by a dense forest and whispers of its cursed past. Some said the people of Ravenwood had angered something, an ancient spirit, a forgotten deity, or perhaps the village itself. Whatever the truth, the stories all ended the same. No one left Ravenwood alive. Ethan's curiosity. Ethan was my closest friend. He was the kind of guy who thrived on challenges, his laugh echoing in the face of danger. So when he first heard about Ravenwood during one of our late-night bonfire gatherings, his curiosity ignited like dry timber. "It's just stories," Ethan said, brushing off the older folks' warnings with a grin. "Ghosts, curses, it's all nonsense to keep kids from wandering too far. We'll prove it, right?" I wasn't so sure. The stories weren't just casual tales, but warnings passed down from generation to generation. People who had ventured into Ravenwood had disappeared without a trace. Yet Ethan's determination was infectious. It was just one night, after all, to explore the so-called haunted village and come back with proof that there was nothing to fear. So, on a chilly October evening, we packed our gear, flashlights, snacks, and Ethan's old camcorder. "We'll document everything," he said, zipping up his bag with an excited glint in his eye. It was hard to say no to Ethan. That night, we set out on a journey that would change everything. The trail leading to Ravenwood was overgrown and uneven, a testament to how long it had been since anyone had dared to walk it. The dense canopy of trees above blocked the moonlight, casting long, sinister shadows across our path. The air was unnaturally still, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. "Spooky, huh?" Ethan joked, breaking the silence. "What do you think? Are we gonna meet the ghost of some angry villager?" I forced a laugh, but my gut told me to turn back. Something about the forest felt alive. Not in the way of rustling leaves or chirping crickets, but as though the trees were watching us, their twisted branches clawing at the air above. We reached a clearing where the remains of Ravenwood emerged. The village looked like a snapshot of decay, crumbling stone walls, roofs caved in, and weeds overtaking what had once been homes. In the center stood the church, its steeple leaning precariously as though bowing to the weight of time. Ethan pulled out his camcorder, panning across the ruins. "This place is awesome," he whispered. "Creepy but awesome." "Let's not stay too long," I said, my voice betraying my unease. Ethan smirked but didn't argue. We began exploring, shining our flashlights into the darkened doorways, and peering into rooms where time had stood still. Yet, as the night wore on, a sense of wrongness settled over me. It started subtly. As Ethan wandered ahead, filming the church, I thought I heard whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to drift on the wind. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the shadows, but there was nothing there. "Ethan," I called out, my voice echoing through the empty village. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" he replied, barely looking up from his camera. "Never mind," I muttered, trying to shake off the feeling. But the whispers continued, growing louder the deeper we ventured into the village. Then came the footsteps. At first they were faint, like someone walking far behind us. But as we moved, they seemed to follow, always keeping the same distance. I stopped in my tracks and turned, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "What now?" Ethan asked, his tone more annoyed than concerned. "I think we're being followed," I said. Ethan rolled his eyes. "It's just your imagination. This place is getting to you." But I wasn't so sure. The whispers and footsteps faded as we approached the church. Ethan's camcorder whirred as he filmed the decrepit building, its heavy wooden doors slightly ajar. "Let's check it out," he said, pushing the door open with a creak that echoed through the night. Inside, the air was thick and cold, carrying the faint scent of decay. Rows of broken pews faced the altar, where a shattered cross hung precariously. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, their meanings lost to time. As we moved deeper into the church, the atmosphere grew oppressive, as though the air itself was trying to push us out. Ethan climbed the narrow staircase to the belfry, determined to capture the view from above. I stayed below, my nerves too frayed to follow. That's when I saw it, a shadow darting across the far end of the room. It was quick, barely more than a flicker, but it was enough to send my heart racing. "Ethan," I called out, my voice trembling. "We need to leave." He didn't answer. Instead, I heard a loud crash from above, followed by the sound of Ethan's frantic footsteps. He stumbled down the stairs, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "We have to go now," he said, grabbing my arm. "What happened?" I asked, but he didn't reply. He dragged me out of the church and back into the open air. As we hurried through the village, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct. They weren't just murmurs now, they were voices, angry and accusatory. The footsteps behind us grew louder, closer. I turned, catching a glimpse of a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing, its form indistinct but menacing. "Run!" Ethan shouted, and we sprinted toward the path leading back to our town. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees closing in around us. The whispers followed, interspersed with guttural growls that sent chills down my spine. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the forest, where the first lights of our town came into view. Only then did we dare to look back. The path behind us was empty, but the forest felt alive, watching, waiting. Back in the safety of my room, Ethan and I sat in silence, the events of the night weighing heavily on us. He finally broke the silence, pulling out his camcorder to review the footage. What we saw chilled us to the core. The video showed more than we had seen with our own eyes. Shadows moved in ways that defied explanation, and faint figures appeared in the corners of the frame watching us. The whispers we had heard were captured clearly, voices speaking in a language neither of us could understand. But the most horrifying part came from the belfry. As Ethan's camera panned across the village from above, it caught something standing in the center of the clearing, a tall, shadowy figure with glowing eyes staring directly at the lens. Ethan slammed the camcorder shut, his hands shaking. "We're not going back there," he said. "Ever." I nodded in agreement, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Something from Ravenwood had followed us, and it wasn't going to let us go so easily. I didn't sleep much after the events of that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I was met with the image of the shadowy figure disappearing into the woods and the terrifying sound of the unseen whispers. The village seemed to grow colder, and the weight of something unspoken hung in the air. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to stay. The mystery demanded answers, and Ethan's behavior, the warnings, and the eerie atmosphere felt like a puzzle begging to be solved. The morning brought no solace. I wandered to the local inn for breakfast, hoping to overhear anything that might shed light on the previous night. The innkeeper, Mrs. Crowley, was a stern woman with deep-set eyes and an uncanny ability to make people talk. However, as soon as I brought up the noises from the woods, the entire room fell silent. Even Mrs. Crowley's usually sharp tongue faltered. "You best keep your head down," she muttered, setting a mug of coffee in front of me. "This village, it doesn't take kindly to prying eyes." "Prying into what?" I asked, trying to meet her gaze. But she turned away, busying herself with a tray of dishes. The other patrons avoided my eyes entirely, and I realized that whatever haunted this place wasn't just supernatural, it was rooted in fear. Later that day, I found Ethan sitting by the old well in the village square. He looked pale, his usual bravado replaced with a haunted expression. "Ethan," I called out, approaching him cautiously. "Are you all right?" He didn't answer immediately, staring into the depths of the well as though it held answers. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You heard it, didn't you? The whispers?" I nodded, my chest tightening. "What's going on here, Ethan? What are you not telling me?" He hesitated before finally looking at me, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't place. "I shouldn't have brought you here. This place, it's cursed." "Cursed how?" I pressed, but before he could answer, an elderly man shuffled past, muttering something under his breath. Ethan's head snapped toward the man, and his face paled further. "We can't talk here," he said abruptly, grabbing my arm. "Meet me at the edge of the woods tonight. I'll explain everything." As the sun set, I prepared for my meeting with Ethan. While waiting, I rummaged through the small pile of books and papers I had brought with me, hoping to distract myself. That's when I found it, an old leather-bound journal. It wasn't mine, nor did I recall seeing it in my belongings before. The cover was scratched, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. Curiosity piqued, I opened it. The first few pages were filled with scrawled notes and drawings of symbols I didn't recognize. Flipping further, I found entries written by someone named William Hart. One entry, dated over a century ago, caught my attention. "The voices are growing stronger. The villagers won't speak of it, but I know they hear them too. At night, the forest comes alive with shadows that dance and whispers that chill the soul. I fear the legend is true. The debt remains unpaid, and the darkness will claim us all." My blood ran cold. Was this the same legend Ethan hinted at? Before I could read further, a knock at the window startled me. I turned to see Ethan outside, gesturing for me to follow. The night air was thick with tension as I met Ethan at the agreed spot. He carried a flashlight and a small leather pouch, his movements jittery and paranoid. "What's going on, Ethan?" I asked. He sighed, glancing toward the trees. "This village, it's built on blood. A long time ago, Lord Hensley struck a deal with something in those woods. The harvests flourished, the people thrived, but the price was steep." I remembered the journal and its reference to an unpaid debt. What was the price? Ethan hesitated. "Every generation, the darkness demands a sacrifice. Someone has to go willingly into the woods and never return." My stomach churned. "That's absurd. You don't really believe that, do you?" "I didn't," he admitted, "until now." Before I could press him further, a sound emerged from the forest, a low, guttural growl that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Ethan's flashlight flickered and his face went pale. "It's coming," he whispered. We didn't have a choice. Whatever was out there wasn't going to wait for us to decide. Ethan motioned for me to follow him into the woods, his flashlight the only source of light in the oppressive darkness. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices speaking a language I couldn't understand. I clutched the journal tightly, feeling as though it was the only thing grounding me. Ethan stopped suddenly, pointing to a clearing up ahead. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, covered in moss and strange carvings. The air around it felt heavy, almost suffocating. "This is where it happens," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "This is where they make the offering." "Who?" I demanded. "Who makes the offering?" Before he could answer, the whispers reached a deafening pitch, and a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, a mass of shifting shadows with glowing, otherworldly eyes. Ethan fell to his knees, clutching his head as if in pain. The figure spoke, its voice resonating inside my skull rather than through the air. "The debt must be paid," it intoned. "One must stay, or the village will fall." I looked at Ethan, who was shaking uncontrollably. "This is why you brought me here, isn't it?" I accused. "You knew this would happen." Tears streamed down his face. I didn't want to believe it. I thought we could end it." The shadow loomed closer, its presence overwhelming. "Choose," it demanded. The moment the crescent moon emerged from behind the heavy clouds, the village seemed to sigh, a low, guttural whisper that sent a shiver coursing through me. Ethan and I stood at the crumbling stone entrance to the forest path, the dense foliage twisting into unnatural shapes as though beckoning us forward. The air was thick with a cloying dampness that reeked of decay, and my heart pounded in rhythm with the faint drumbeat emanating from the woods. We had returned to the forest out of desperation. Ethan, despite his overwhelming fear, was resolute. The village was no longer an option. Its residents were either complicit in the strange happenings or too ensnared by fear to offer any aid. He clung to the belief that the forest, and its forbidden altar, was the key to breaking free from whatever dark grip the village held over us. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the sense of being watched intensified. Shadows flitted between the trees, moving unnaturally fast, and yet somehow lingering just long enough to make their presence undeniable. Ethan's flashlight beam darted nervously, its weak light swallowed almost entirely by the oppressive darkness. "We shouldn't have come back," I whispered, my voice trembling. Ethan didn't respond. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. His determination was unsettling, almost as though something unseen was pulling him forward. The drum beats grew louder, resonating deep in my chest. They were accompanied by faint whispers, indistinct but filled with malice. The path suddenly opened into a clearing, and there it stood, the altar. It was smaller than I had imagined, carved from black stone and covered in pulsating moss that seemed alive. Around it, the trees twisted inward, their branches interlocked like skeletal fingers, forming a natural dome above. The clearing was unnaturally silent now, the drum beats and whispers abruptly gone. Ethan stepped forward, his movements robotic. "Ethan, wait!" I grabbed his arm, but he shook me off with surprising force. "We have to finish this," he muttered, his voice distant. Ethan knelt before the altar, his hands trembling as he brushed away the moss to reveal intricate carvings. The symbols glowed faintly, their meaning lost to me but clearly comprehensible to him. His lips moved in a whisper, reciting something I couldn't hear. The air grew colder, and a low growl echoed from the surrounding trees. I spun around, my flashlight flickering. Shadows gathered at the edges of the clearing, humanoid in form but with hollow, glowing eyes. "Ethan, we're not alone," I cried, backing toward him. He didn't respond. The carvings on the altar flared with a blinding white light, and Ethan let out a guttural scream. The shadows surged forward, their movements disjointed and unnatural. I grabbed Ethan's shoulder, trying to pull him away from the altar, but it was as though he was rooted in place. The light from the altar enveloped him, and his scream grew louder, more distorted. His body convulsed violently before collapsing to the ground. "Ethan!" I shouted, shaking him. The light from the altar faded, and the shadows froze. Then, in unison, they turned their hollow gazes toward me. A voice, deep, guttural, and inhuman, boomed from the altar. "Why have you come?" I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. We just wanted to leave the village." The voice laughed, a sound that made my blood run cold. "The village is mine, as are all who enter it. There is no escape." I turned to Ethan, who stirred weakly. His eyes fluttered open, but they were different, his pupils replaced by the same hollow glow as the shadows. "Run," he whispered, his voice distorted. The shadows closed in, their forms becoming more distinct. Faces emerged, twisted and anguished, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached for me with clawed hands, their movements agonizingly slow but deliberate. Panicked, I bolted toward the path, the whispers and growls chasing me. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing at my clothes and roots rising to trip me. I didn't dare look back. The path ahead blurred, and I suddenly found myself back at the edge of the village. The oppressive silence was replaced by an eerie hum. I turned around, expecting to see the shadows emerging from the forest, but the path was empty. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The village was still and dark, its windows like empty eyes staring at me. I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever had claimed Ethan wasn't bound to the forest. Summoning what little courage I had left, I made my way to the main road. The night seemed endless, the moon a faint sliver in the sky. Every step felt like an eternity, but eventually, the first rays of dawn broke through the horizon. When I reached the next town, I collapsed on the steps of a small cafe. A kind stranger helped me inside, and I recounted my story between sobs. The police were called, but their search yielded no trace of Ethan, the altar, or even the village itself. Months later, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and faint whispers echoed in quiet moments. I researched tirelessly, finding vague references to cursed villages and ancient altars, but nothing concrete. Ethan's face haunted my dreams, his hollow eyes a constant reminder of the price we paid for our curiosity. Even now, as I tell this story, I can feel it, the weight of the shadows lingering just out of sight. The village may be gone, but its curse remains, tethered to me like a ghostly chain. If you ever come across a place that feels wrong, where the air is too heavy, the silence too loud, turn back. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Thank you for joining me on this terrifying journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales of the paranormal.